The game begins before minions spawn, and no, I'm not just talking about warding the enemy raptors or getting control of the bot lane bush. The real game-defining decisions actually happen in champion select. Now, everyone already knows the feeling of having your last pick force you into a full AD comp, only to see the enemy then lock in Malphite, or having an AP bot laner, having your whole team somehow still draft AP, seeing just about any tank and knowing that you've already lost. But champion select, man, it is way more than ensuring you just have a mix of damage. Now take a draft like this one here. You've got strong bot lane that synergize amazingly together. Frontline, CC, engage, all for the Samira, a nice mix of AD and AP damage, wave clear from the Syndra, and Gnar does round it out perfectly here, bringing potential to both side lane and go all in for team fights, which is exactly what this comp does want to do. It seems pretty well rounded, at least on the face. Only this comp is, well, it's terrible, and it's all because of one concept: item value. Now, hopefully, every single one of you watching right now would see this composition on the enemy team and think one thing: Merc treads, Leona's whole kit, Fiddle's fear and Fiddle's damage, Gnar stuns, and then a burst mage on top of that also happens to have another stun. Mercs provide so much value here for the enemy team that they don't even need to consider their boot choice. Something you have to understand about items in League, though, is that by design, some are just absurdly efficient at countering one specific thing. And when picking your champion in draft, this is something that you should always have in the back of your mind, as you can keep the exact same synergies a comp needs while making mercs far less valuable and far less clear-cut of a buy. Instead of Syndra, how about something like Victor, or maybe Orianna instead, which still brings the magic damage, it still brings the wave clear and the team fighting, only they're not as heavily reliant on CC and not as heavily reliant on burst. Maybe Alistar or Nautilus instead of Leona for your support pick. Again, both do the same job as Leona, only they don't get nearly as affected by tenacity. Or maybe you have a ton of CC and you force your opponents to have to buy mercs. You could compensate by stacking multiple auto-attack champions to exploit their lack of steel caps. A great example of this was the 2026 Road to MSI Game 2 between T1 and HLE. With Rakan and Lysindra, T1 basically forced the enemy to buy mercs, but T1 picked Sivir, Nocturne, and even Ambessa to a lesser extent here. So as the entire HLE team are forced to grab mercs, FaZe can just completely mow them down, and there's a handful of other items just like this too. Now on the flip side, we all know drafting full AD is inherently bad, but so is too many auto-attack based champions. Meaning if you had a composition like this and needed magic damage from the top lane, a pick like Gwen or Kayle is again gonna make the value of plated steel caps and even Frozen Heart ridiculously high compared to instead picking something like maybe a Gragas. Taking that same composition, we also have 3 champions who all build crit, which will make something like an Ornn or tank jungler with an early Randuin's Omen just get absurd value from the item. Meaning if you're picking an ADC and already see Kindred and Yasuo, an on-hit ADC like Varus is going to be far better for your draft. Serpent's Fang, it's another one. If you have a Riven top and Lee Sin jungle, you're not going to want to pick something like an Orianna in the mid lane or Karma as your support. Same thing with Grievous Wounds. If you already have a Soraka, you're going to want to avoid drafting champions that also get heavily countered by healing reduction, like a Blood mid or Aatrox in the same team. The point through all of this is that these items are already overly efficient when dealing with just a singular champion. But when you stack multiple champions that all get answered by the same item, both your pick and team composition get countered and are so much weaker as a whole. Now, by the way, we created a custom course just for this guide at SkillCapped.com. It's there that you're going to unlock 4 more site-exclusive videos where we walk you through exactly how you can gain even more of an advantage in champion select and draft. And pair this up with our Season 16 essentials for every role, designed to walk you through every state of the game from start to finish, from learning the exact trading and recall timers that you need to win lane, to the mid-game decisions 99% of players get completely wrong, all the way to the team fighting tips and tricks challengers abuse to always deal the highest damage possible, and our challenger commentaries where our challenger players and coaches walk you through exactly how to carry on your chosen champion, as well as so much more from macro to wave control to vision and everything in between. You can check this all out completely risk-free, as if you don't climb at least 5 divisions while actively using our service, you get every penny back. Get your one-time exclusive discount code in the description or pinned comment below, and finally get the rank of your dreams this season. But aside from item value, one of the ways you can start to see an immediate increase in your win rate, though, is by considering team dynamics. And this starts by first understanding the trifecta of team compositions, which in a way is kind of like rock, paper, scissors, and bear with me on this. You have front to back, you have dive, and pick/poke. Front to back is generally the most well-rounded and easy to play. A beefy front line, high sustained damage, medium range, with their goal being to let people come into them, hit the closest target, and enable their carries to do damage. Now, dive compositions generally have much shorter range and a weaker front line, but make up for it with multiple engage tools and higher burst damage. Think champions that just want to go in, get on the back line, and kill them quickly. Then lastly, you have pick/poke, which have little to no front line, very long range, and high single target damage. And generally, they consist of really slippery and hard to get onto champions, which rely on picking targets off or heavily poking before a team fight even happens. Now, a front to back composition is going to have an easier time against a dive composition, as they have so many tools to save and protect their carries. So in this example here, to help drive this home, Kled and Rel are far less tanky than Mundo, and likely will die first in a fight, at which point Jinx and Victor get resets and clean up. However, against a pick/poke composition, they're just going to be outranged, and their only engage tool here is Zen E or Mundo running straight at them, so it's basically going to be impossible for them to start a fight, forcing them to eat constant poke. All while a dive composition is actually going to counter that poke composition, as they could just immediately pull the trigger before they take any meaningful damage. Which all makes sense in theory. I can get how some of this might be confusing as I'm explaining it, but you're probably wondering after hearing that, what does this mean for you in solo queue? Well, although you're rarely, if ever, going to build a perfect team composition, there's a couple of things that you should always consider and think about. First, try to lock in a champion that stylistically counters your opponent's picks thus far. So if you see, let's say, Lux and Caitlyn picked early on, they've got the start of an extremely long-range composition. Based on our logic that we just talked about, you should try to pick more of a dive champion that can get to the backline, avoiding the short-range picks without engage. Meaning if you're mid lane and you can't see your opponent yet, you don't want to lock in something like an Anivia or Cassiopeia, as even if you're not directly laning against those champions, you're still going to have to deal with them in team fights. So if you're jungle, you're going to have a much easier time on something like a Zac or Talon, Camille or Malphite if you're up top, Fizz or Ahri if you're mid, and maybe a Nautilus or Kai'Sa if you're in the bot lane. Now, second, aim to pick something that synergizes with your team's current picks, or even their hovers, which, side note here, hovering your intended champion is incredibly beneficial and something you should always look to do for this very reason. For example, let's say your first pick is Samira, and your jungler's hovering Diana. You clearly have the beginnings of a dive composition here, meaning rather than picking something like a Sona or Lulu, or maybe Xerath/Vel'Koz, you want champions that, at the very least, complement that style. And wait a second here. Hold up. Before you pause the video, go to the comments, and you type something like, but I only play enchanters or control mages, surely comfort is always going to be better. Well, yes, it is, and we're going to be addressing that here in just a minute. But while team synergy and this trifecta is always something to consider, it's not what actually makes or even breaks a team's composition. Let's say you jump into a champ select and see your top is hovering Jace. Great, poke comp. Your bot lane first picks Jhin ADC and Vel'Koz bot. Your jungle hovers Nidalee. Awesome. You've now got some out-of-this-world poke composition. Surely a Xerath would be fantastic in this comp, right? Well, no. And here's the problem. So if you look and see here, the enemy team first picked Nautilus and have now locked in Jarvan and Katarina. With that much dive and engage, you obviously do not want to then lock in Xerath and commit to even more poke, as the game is just going to be completely unplayable from that point. Instead, even though he didn't necessarily fit the team composition to begin with, something like Galio actually becomes perfect here. You can ult when they dive on your Jhin and Vel'Koz, peel for your team with taunt, and just help to keep everybody alive in the process. So while not being a poke champion himself, Galio still does fit in this predominantly poke composition. This is why it's going to be important to factor in both how your team's picks want to play, but also how your opponent's comp wants to play as well. And the best way to do this and to really think about it is to pay more attention to champion synergies rather than the team compositions as a whole, with the two most game-warping roles in this department in most cases are going to be support and jungle. So let's say your jungler blind picks Graves. Now, there's two things to consider here. First, we all know how Graves tends to play. They're going to want to permanently try to invade, flip the game, and be super aggressive early, meaning a solo laner or top laner picking a weak early game champion like Kassadin or Vlad is obviously going completely against his game plan. Not only are you not going to have priority, meaning he's never going to be able to invade, but what else is wrong with this draft? Well, if Graves tries to gank literally literally any of the lanes, there's zero crowd control or setup. You need two things to make ganks effective: damage and crowd control. Graves does bring a ton of damage, but he needs his laners to have the setup for him. So by swapping our mid lane pick to something like an Ahri, for example, we now have a much stronger early laner and also set up for our Graves, meaning we immediately have far more champion synergy. Now, of course, we could keep the Kassadin, but then we'd need a jungler that brings his own crowd control, like a Rek'Sai, for example. And this is always something that you should look to consider. If you have a Graves, a Lee Sin, or Nidalee, aim to pick something with CC and setup. Whereas if you have a Jarvan, Elise, or Vi, or any CC coming from your jungler, you can be a little bit more flexible with your pick. Now, we did mention support is also super important to consider as well. It obviously goes without saying that having synergy between your bot lane duo is always going to be beneficial. And we all know if you have something like maybe a Kai'Sa or Samira, you're going to want an engaged support that sets them up. Or maybe you have a Smolder or Senna, it's often going to be better to have an Enchanter or something that helps to neutralize the lane and let them scale. But you also have to think about jungle support synergy too, especially in the higher elos. These are the two roles that can impact the map the most, and often all skirmishes and fights around objectives include both your jungler and your support. Again, going back to the first point, if you have a jungler that typically wants to play aggressive and have an impact early, picking a scalar enchanter like Sona means there's very little synergy between these two champions, and the game becomes a whole lot more difficult to play. But this brings up something that's incredibly important when building your champion pool, because while champions like Graves or Sona can be extremely powerful in the right circumstances, they push your team toward a very specific way of playing. And while there's nothing wrong with that type of playing, you want to avoid having every champion you play require champion synergy. This is where neutral picks become a whole lot more valuable. Now, neutral picks are champions that can fit into multiple styles of composition without completely changing what your team needs. For support, let's say you're a diehard Enchanter main. Well, you'd want neutral picks like Karma, Seraphine, or Nami in your champion pool. They can pair with any ADC or even Mage in the bot lane. They bring crowd control if your ADC or jungler needs it, are decent roamers, bring disengage, engage, or follow up, and can play aggressively and also play to scale. You're going to find neutral picks like this in every single role and across every type of archetype. An ADC like Jinx or Aphelios, they can play with an engaged support, but can also play to scale with something like a Sona or Lulu. Something like a Syndra or Ahri in the mid lane is going to fit any type of composition. Ornn and Shin in the top lane, or even Jarvan and Vi in the jungle. All of these picks, every one of them, they don't require any champion synergy to perform well, and they simply work fine in any composition that you put them in. And having neutral picks like these in your champion pool is really going to be crucial when it comes to drafting in solo queue. So let's say you're a mid laner. Having a pool of LeBlanc, Orianna, and Diana would mean you have practically every base covered here. LeBlanc works in dive as she can follow up on engage, she can work in poke by picking players off. Orianna is a great blind pick without too many bad matchups and works in practically any situation, and Diana is great too if you need engage or playing dive, while also being good in the side lane. You can't cover every single base perfectly, but having a pool that covers a wide array of situations is going to be good enough here, which all leads us pretty nicely into pick order. Now, this is definitely a little bit of a touchy subject, and I understand that here, but for solo queue, the most optimal pick order is widely seen as ADC first, as you're not really susceptible to being counterpicked, as it's often the support that has way more agency over how the lane plays out, plus there's a ton of neutral ADCs that can just work really in any situation. Then after that, jungle. Now obviously counters do still exist here, like playing a Nefiri into a Nocturne, which has a 43% win rate, as he can just kill all your dogs instantly, but you can always just play around your jungle counters, either by adapting your pathing or just avoiding them as much as possible. The game's still going to be far more playable than for counters and other roles. Now, depending on who you ask though, and other channels that you watch, some are going to say support should go next after jungle, and others, they're going to say mid lane. And look, arguments can be made for both of these, but for solo queue, we're going to typically go with wanting your support pick next. Remember to factor in both your ADC and your jungle synergy here, but as support has most of the agency in bot lane, it's always going to be huge to have a favorable matchup. For instance, locking in a Braum early in a draft is just going to result in them picking a ton of ranged champions and leaving you completely useless. Now, after support, it's mid. Again, counters obviously do still exist here, but with the shorter lane, you can always wave clear and play safer. Whereas last pick should always go to top, as top lane is just completely brutal, with matchups having way more impact than any other role. And look, as we've been talking about throughout this whole video now, consider your own team and the enemy team's draft. And if you're blind picking, aim for something more neutral. Obviously though, when it comes to solo queue, getting players to cooperate with you is is always going to be a challenge. But here's some tips to hopefully make your life just a little bit easier. Now, first of all, avoid swapping early into the draft. Let's say you're a Yasuo main or any champion with way too many counters to blind pick. You get into champion select and you're first picking for your team. So you swap your ADC, who's last pick straight away, but they decline as nobody wants to get countered. The enemy then first pick Jinx. Only now, if you try to swap with your ADC, you can't, as Riot locks you from being able to do that. The result is you end up blind picking Yasuo, getting countered by Pantheon in a completely unplayable matchup, and you lose the game. Terrible. This is why you always want to initiate a swap with whatever role the enemy team has already locked in, as the chances of them actually accepting is going to be infinitely higher. And if you're first pick, there's always a higher chance of swapping with somebody already hovering a champ, as they're most likely a one-trick who's a little more capable of handling a bad matchup. Now, there's also another reason why it's good to wait until you swap. A little trick for champion select is that if you swap before the bans are locked in, your banned champion will always match the order you pick in, making it very obvious which lane you're going. But if you swap after that ban phase, your ban no longer matches with your pick. Meaning if you're playing something that can flex, maybe like a Tristana mid, but you banned LeBlanc, by swapping with your ADC who's playing Hwei and banned Draven, the enemy team will see that the player playing Tristana banned Draven, so we'll just assume they're playing bot lane. And you could do this with any champion that can flex across multiple roles by swapping with a teammate who banned a champion from that specific role, giving you a far better chance of not only getting a better matchup in your own role, but also for your teammates you swapped with. And you can even sell this harder by cycling through a few other champions that go into that role, giving the impression that you're contemplating your pick. Realistically, a lot of what we covered in this video won't be perfectly applicable in every one of your solo queue games, and it would be silly to think that it ever would, right? But you don't need these concepts to decide every game for them to be valuable. Across the next 100 games that you play, turning just one loss into a win is already an extra 1% added to your win rate. And when climbing ultimately comes down to consistently winning slightly more games than you lose, these tiny advantages can really start to add up. Now, with that being said, there is one final rule that's more important than everything else that we talked about in this video, and that, of course, is comfort is king. Let's be honest, this is not pro play. Never force your teammates onto champions that they can't play just because they theoretically fit the composition that you think will play better. If your support is an enchanter main, forcing them onto an engaged champion they barely understand is probably not going to improve your draft, even if engage is exactly what your team is missing. An entire mismatched draft with players on comfortable champions is usually going to be far more effective than a perfectly synergistic team where players have no idea what they're doing. So, that said, work with what your teammates give you. Try to be flexible when your champion pool allows it to, and pick around the strengths where you really can. But don't force them or yourself onto something completely unfamiliar just for the sake of a draft. And if you enjoyed this guide, we created a custom course where you'll unlock 4 more exclusive videos with even more information over at SkillCapped.com, alongside our complete Season 16 Essentials courses, Challenger commentaries, guides covering everything from laning and macro to team fighting, and you can try this all completely risk-free, as if you don't climb at least 5 divisions while actively using the service, you get your money back. Grab the exclusive discount link in the description or pinned comment below. For now, though, that wraps up this video. Thank you all for watching, and we'll catch you in the next one.